she had no place left to turn. A solitary cattleman offered refuge to a wayward bride for just one evening. By dawn, she had transformed everything he thought he knew about living. The Montana wilderness. In the harsh depths of winter, 1887, snowflakes descended like whispered secrets across the barren landscape. Elias Granger, 32 years weathered, had battled frozen plumbing all day in the unforgiving chill. The water lines had cracked again during the night's freeze. He trudged back to his remote timber dwelling as twilight painted the sky. Smoke curled peacefully from his stone chimney. Carrying his flickering lantern through the doorway, he brushed ice crystals from his jacket and stopped cold. Delicate impressions in the snow led directly to his fireside, then wavered uncertainly back toward the entrance. His muscles tensed as he reached for his hunting rifle, but movement from his modest cooking area caught his attention first. Setting the lamp aside, he spoke into the shadows. "Is someone here?" A voice, fragile and barely audible, emerged from near the dying embers. "Forgive me. I believe this home stood empty. There's nowhere left for me to seek shelter." Elias hesitated, his grip loosening on the weapon. Through the dim glow, he spotted a young woman among toppled furniture and scattered kitchenware. Her skirt's edge was crusted with ice and mud. Vapor rose from her lips in the cold air. Damp hair framed her face in tangled strands. Frost clung to her ashen cheeks. Her gaze darted between his rifle and the exit behind her. Annabelle Moore, 24. A correspondence bride who had journeyed 30 miles to a settlement where no one awaited her arrival. Had wandered through ridge paths during a fierce storm until she glimpsed the distant warmth of Elias's window. She had knocked briefly before entering the unlocked entrance, hoping either for occupants or that empty places might welcome wanderers more kindly than the populated world. Elias remained motionless for several long moments. Wind battered the wooden shutters as something deep within him stirred. He slowly lowered his weapon. Annabelle's frame sagged with relief. He retrieved a thick woolen wrap from his storage, placed it around her shivering form, then knelt to rekindle the stove flames. The fire hissed back to life. A kettle found its place among the coals as he began feeding wood to the hearth. She pulled the blanket close and gave a small nod. "Rest here until the weather breaks," he offered quietly. Her eyes widened, lips quivering as she nodded wordlessly. He moved deliberately, setting a heated iron pot of brewed tea on the rough table and indicating a nearby seat. She settled without pause, pressing her palms against the warm metal. Steam rose gently between them. After removing his outer coat and draping it over a chair for her use, Elias cleared a space in the corner. His cupboards held basic provisions: ground corn, dried beans, preserved meat, nothing particularly welcoming. He filled a chipped enamel mug with the hot liquid and slid it toward her. She lifted it with trembling fingers and studied him through tired lashes. He observed her with quiet attention. Her eyes held the color of winter mist, haunted and worn, as though kindness had been a rare gift in her world. An unfamiliar longing stirred within him, like an anchor to something he hadn't dared seek since his wife's passing 2 seasons prior. She sipped again, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone more deserving to appear. Elias cleared his throat softly. "I'll prepare our evening meals soon. If you desire something warm, I'll need assistance. Can you manage?" She nodded silently. He paused. "Help if you wish, or simply rest. Both are acceptable." She rose and moved with careful purpose. Retrieving a tin pan and chopping herbs from a jar beside the table, he watched her hands work, steady, precise, exhausted, recognizing that giving her tasks might provide more comfort than idle rest. The tempest raged beyond the walls as night deepened. Elias lit another lamp, observing her stir cornmeal and salt pork in the skillet. He placed utensils within her reach and shared his portion. She offered only a grateful nod. Though her expression softened, the wind shook the cabin's foundation while snow slid from the roof in muffled crashes. He turned the pot toward the flames to simmer and went to gather bedding. Upon returning, he found her wrapped in his wool coat, settling toward sleep on a low bench. He positioned himself across the hearth, deliberately ignoring the unexpected tightness in his chest. Watching flames dance in the darkness, "Thank you for not turning me away," she murmured faintly. He responded with only a slight nod, but in that gesture he accepted something both delicate and invaluable. The mantel clock had ceased working months ago, yet time seemed to resume its rhythm in that flickering light. Elias gazed once more at Annabelle's resting form, solitary, weary, forsaken by a world she had trusted, and felt warmth rise within him that no winter could extinguish. He draped a blanket over her sleeping figure and settled deeper into his chair, as if keeping vigil over something precious, beyond the walls. The wind wailed, but within their shelter. The fire crackled, and two lives began an unexpected transformation. Snow continued falling like sifted powder through the morning hours. Ilias's cabin timbers creaked softly as gusts swept over the rooftop. Inside, flames still burned, casting amber shadows across the wooden floor. Annabelle lay curled on the bench near the fireplace, her face peaceful in exhaustion, one arm wrapped protectively around herself. Elias occupied his chair, alert. Sleep had eluded him as he maintained his watchful yet respectful distance. Companionship was foreign to him, especially feminine company. Certainly not women who appeared from the cold bearing only injured hands and fearful eyes. But she hadn't attempted deception. She hadn't pleaded desperately. She had simply asked, then fallen silent at sunrise. Elias slipped outside to tend his horse, break ice from the water trough, and split sufficient wood for the day. Returning inside, he discovered the kettle already warming and 2 cups arranged on the table. Annabelle stood at the wash basin, quietly cleaning the tin plates from their supper. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, hair secured with a ribbon scrap from her belongings. "I hope you don't object," she said softly upon noticing him. "I thought it proper to contribute my share." Elias shrugged without harshness. "Should you damage anything, the repair would fall to you." She smiled faintly and continued rinsing. Without turning, she inquired, "Do you have sewing supplies?" He gestured toward a wooden container by the fireplace. She located thread and needle, then sat near the window, mending one of his worn flannel shirts with practiced fingers. Elias poured coffee into both cups and set one beside her. He settled across the room, holding his own mug silently before asking, "Who arranged your journey?" Annabelle's stitching paused. Her throat worked once before she responded, "I'm uncertain. The correspondence reached my boarding house through the Denver agency. It stated a gentleman in Bitter Hollow sought a wife. I signed their papers, boarded the coach, and upon arrival, no one appeared. The station clerk directed me toward the road, suggesting if I hurried, I might find someone traveling north." She looked up apologetically. "I suppose I wasn't what he sought after all." Elias frowned, staring into his cup. "You mentioned nursing experience?" Annabelle nodded. "During the Virginia conflict, afterward, little remained. My father succumbed to fever to winters past. My mother lost her will before spring arrived. The correspondence agency seemed my final option." Elias remained quiet for some time. Snow brushed the windows like whispered doubts. Outside, the path to town vanished beneath accumulating drifts. He rose, pulled his coat from its peg, and approached the door. Opening it, frigid wind howled inside. Annabelle winced. "You're venturing out?" He glanced back. "I plan to escort you to the church in town. Let Reverend Whitaker address this situation." But he gestured toward the snow consuming the fence posts. "We're not traveling anywhere today." Annabelle lowered her gaze. "I understand." That evening, the storm intensified. Wind shrieked through gaps in the logs as Elias fed wood to the fire until it blazed hot and steady. He opened a small tin from the rear cupboard containing a wrapped parcel of dried mushrooms. Morels gathered from northern ridges, something he'd preserved untouched for 3 years. He began chopping them into the pot over the fire. Annabelle looked surprised. "Those are precious." He nodded once. "I saved them for the most bitter day." Her brow furrowed. "Is today the most bitter?" Elias stirred the soup slowly. "Perhaps not, but it's the first day someone else has occupied this table since she passed." Annabelle grew still. He ladled soup into 2 bowls and handed her one. She accepted it with both hands, watching him carefully. I'll ensure you reach town when the storm clears, Elias stated. Annabelle nodded. She tasted the soup and closed her eyes as warmth spread through her. Beyond the walls, wind battered the roof, but inside the cabin, something unfamiliar settled between them. Quiet understanding. And the fragile beginning of trust. The storm persisted for 3 days. Snow accumulated like sand dunes along the porch, while the sky remained the color of cold ash. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere held pine smoke, steam, and the quiet rhythm of two people learning to share space without excessive conversation. Elias maintained his routines, splitting wood, boiling water, preserving meat, and feeding the mule when visibility permitted. But now, a second cup graced the table. Another pair of boots. Dre. The fire crackled between them. Elias stood and walked to the mantel, opening a drawer beneath the shelf to retrieve a weathered photograph. Its edges were curled, the glass cracked. It showed a woman with auburn hair and a soft, crooked smile. "My wife," he said, placing it beside the snowflake. "Scarlet fever took her. I buried her under that ridge behind the barn." Annabelle's eyes softened. She reached out and adjusted the snowflake slightly so it rested beside the photograph, not covering it, not replacing it, only accompanying it. Elias looked at her, then at the table, and nodded. They spoke no more of it that night. But when the wind howled and the fire sputtered low, Elias rose and added 2 more logs, not for warmth, but because something in the silence needed protecting. Outside, snow continued falling, but inside, grief began to thaw just a little. By the 5th morning, the sky broke wide open. The wind calmed, the sun emerged pale and thin above the white horizon, and the world appeared scrubbed clean. Elias hitched the mule, wrapped Annabelle in a spare wool coat, and set off down the icy road toward Galloway town. 20 miles over hard snow and frozen ruts lay ahead. They spoke little. But Annabelle's gloved hand gripped the sled's side rail while her eyes remained fixed on the hills ahead. Elias kept his gaze forward, too, jaw set tight. The town appeared just after midday. Chimneys smoked, boots crunched, and gossip traveled faster than snow melt. They reached the church first, a squat white building with a bell tower and frost-covered windows. Elias secured the mule and led Annabelle up the steps. Inside, warmth struck first, then silence. Several women sat knitting near the back pews. One looked up and narrowed her eyes. The pastor, a stout man in his 60s, with a crooked collar, approached when Elias called his name. "We need lodging for her," Elias said. "Correspondent's bride abandoned up north. She causes no trouble." The pastor squinted. "Name?" "Annabelle Moore," she said softly. He pulled out a heavy book and flipped pages. "No record," he muttered. "No husband signed for her. No payment registered. She's not legally wed. I never claimed to be," Annabelle said quietly. Someone behind them whispered just loudly enough. "She's one of the rejected ones. You can always tell." Another voice responded sharper. "Traveled all this way just to get past." Round Annabelle's breath caught. She turned, backing toward the door. Elias stood motionless, his jaw working silently. But he said nothing yet. Annabelle pushed open the church doors and stepped into the cold. Snow had begun falling again, slow and hushed. She stood under the awning, arms wrapped around herself, trembling as much from shame as from cold. Elias followed. She didn't look at him, just whispered, "I'm not who you believe I am." "I know exactly who you are," Elias said. "You emerged from the snow into my kitchen. You mended my sleeve. You brewed my tea. You cleaned ash from my stove. And you never requested anything but space to breathe." She blinked, her eyes glistening. "I brought you here to be claimed," he said, his voice low and steady. "I didn't know it would be by me." She looked up at him, truly looked. The wind curled around them, sharp and sweet with pine. "I'm not pure," she whispered. "Not untouched." "I'm not whole," he replied. "Not unchanged." Snow caught in her lashes. She started to speak, but Elias stepped forward, removed his glove, and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. Not forcefully, just enough for her to feel the truth in it. "Do you want to return with me?" he asked. Annabelle swallowed hard. "I don't have anywhere else to go." "You do now," Elias said. They turned together, walking down the steps toward the mule and sled. Behind them, the church bell tolled, not for a wedding, not for a funeral, perhaps for the beginning of something not yet named. Snow still blanketed the world. When Elias and Annabelle returned to the Granger homestead, but inside the cabin, dawn felt warmer than any storm could touch. Elias stirred the ashes of the old iron stove until embers glowed orange, adjusted the chimney for clear smoke, then began arranging split logs in the rack. Annabelle watched from the doorway. Wrapped in her wool coat, breath misting in the soft light, she didn't speak, just nodded when he pointed toward a wooden chair. Elias brought in furniture, a wooden table he'd carved years ago, and a spare bedroll from the loft. He cleared a corner near the stove and placed a small trunk beside it. Annabelle helped by sweeping the floor with a hand broom and stacking blankets neatly. Her quiet presence filled the room more than any words could. He went outside to fetch water and ice from the trough while she pulled a sewing bag from her travel satchel and began mending a torn sleeve. She didn't ask permission, but Elias noticed. Later, he found a tin of dried cornmeal and gave it to her. She smiled, measuring out enough with a wooden spoon. When the stove was hot again, Elias gathered yellow cornmeal, a handful of sugar, a bit of lard, and a pinch of salt. Annabelle joined him near the hearth, pulling out the skillet and wooden spoon. Hand steady, she stirred the batter slowly, humming softly under her breath. Elias watched her carefully, then set a skillet of fat near the flames. She ladled batter onto the hot griddle. The first cake hissed and browned. She flipped it gently and offered the steaming cornbread to him, torn in half without hesitation. He bit into it slowly. The crust was crisp, the middle soft and warm. He nodded, pleased. "I learned to bake as a child," she said quietly. "My mother made cornbread every Sunday. I loved making sugar cakes, and naturally, I made pies." He smiled faintly. "I haven't tasted any since my wife's time." Annabelle shook her head softly. "It's a simple thing, but it's something they didn't converse much after that. Only routine sounds filled the air, the crackle of fire, the whisper of broom, the soft scraping of wood as Elias split logs outside. She showed him how to dampen a cloth before sweeping to catch dust. He showed her how to split a dry log so it cleaved along the grain. Their hands brushed lightly as they worked. It's just enough to acknowledge trust. Mid-afternoon, a small knock sounded at the door. Elias opened it to reveal Clara, the orphan girl from town. No more than 7, eyes damp from tears, shoulders shaking against a tattered shawl. She stood clutching a tin bucket that had once held salt. "Mr. Granger," she said shyly, voice small, "I have nowhere to go. Might I? Might I have some wood, please?" Annabelle reached out instantly, stepping forward with a skillet of cornbread in hand. She knelt and offered the child a piece, crumbly and warm. Clara took it, cheeks pink with surprise. Annabelle stood and motioned her inside. Clara ducked through the doorway, setting her bucket on the floor. Elias, stepping aside, fetched a small bundle of kindling and several split logs from the rack. Clara's eyes widened. He simply said, "Take this for tonight, and if you're hungry, more cornbread will be ready in the morning." Clara bowed in a manner too polite for her age, put the wood into her bucket, and scurried out, cornbread in hand. Annabelle closed the door and leaned against it, catching her breath. "I should have asked before opening the door," she murmured. Elias reached out, brushed a crumb from her sleeve, and placed the empty cornbread skillet on the table. "I don't want you to face hunger alone," he said softly. The sky outside softened into evening with snow flurries drifting down. But inside the cabin, something settled that hadn't been there before, a sense of home becoming possible. That night, after tucking Annabelle into the bedroll near the stove, Elias came to her corner with a small wooden board. By its dark grain, he burned words with a heated poker. "This cabin is no longer a place of silence." He leaned over the hearth and placed the board gently against the wall. Annabelle stirred, but didn't wake. Elias stood back and examined his work by candlelight. The letters glowed warm, bold, but simple. Beneath them, a tiny sprig of lavender tied with string lay pressed. "It's time for warmth again," he said softly, to no one but the room. Outside, the wind sighed through the eaves. Inside, the hearth crackled, and in that moment, a cabin once isolated by snow and sorrow became a place where quiet gestures spoke louder than words, and where a single decision shaped the turning of two lives forever. Morning arrived, crisp and sharp. The sky stretched clean and blue, the snow outside crusted under the light of the rising sun. Annabelle stood on the porch, sleeves rolled up, pinning laundry along a line stretched between two cedar posts. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her hands red from washing. Behind her, inside the cabin, Elias was sanding a length of pine near the fireplace, his hands sticky with resin. He whistled low under his breath, a habit long forgotten and newly returned. Then came the sound of hooves, crunching frost, slow and deliberate. Annabelle looked up. A large black wagon rolled into the clearing, the kind used to haul supplies or cattle, or sometimes worse. It stopped with a jolt. The door creaked open. Out stepped a man in a long tan coat and a hat to clean for a place like this. Roy Mercer, 45 tall, slick, with silver buckles on his boots and a ledger always tucked under his arm. Annabelle's breath caught. Her arms lowered, her face drained of color. "Roy," she whispered. Almost inaudible, he grinned as he approached, hands in pockets. "Well, I'll be damned. You made yourself cozy." Without knocking, Roy pushed through the cabin door, his boots thudding across the wooden floor. Annabelle followed slowly, frozen. Elias turned at the sound. Wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes narrowed, Roy held up a folded piece of paper. "She's mine. Correspondence contract, signed and paid. Deposit right here in ink. Which means what you've got here is property, cowboy." Annabelle stepped back, trembling. Elias stood still, letting the words settle. Then he walked forward slowly, placing himself between them. Roy smirked. "You hiding my goods, cowboy?" Elias said nothing. Roy pushed him. Elias staggered, caught his footing, and without a word swung. His fist met Roy's jaw with a dull crack. Roy stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the table. A thin trickle of blood ran from his nose. Outside, a few neighbors, drawn by the wagon and voices, stopped near the gate. They watched silently. Roy straightened up, waving the paper in the air. "You all see this?" He shouted. "This woman was bought fair and legal. I came to collect what's mine." The crowd murmured. Elias wiped his knuckles on his coat. He looked around, then turned back into the cabin. Annabelle stood still near the stove, eyes brimming with tears. A minute later, Elias emerged. In his hand was a leather pouch, weathered and thick. The one he'd buried under the loose floorboard, filled with silver coins and paper bills saved over 3 years. He placed it in Roy's hand. "There, that's what you paid, plus more. Now she owes you nothing, and I owe her everything." Roy glanced inside the pouch. It was more than fair. It was more than the value of any paper contract. He opened his mouth to protest, but Elias stepped closer, his voice like ice. "Leave, and next time you put a price on a woman's life, make sure you can afford the man who loves her." Roy blinked. The crowd didn't cheer, didn't clap. But no one moved to stop Elias. No one stepped to Roy's side. Elias turned, took Annabelle's hand and held it up for all to see. "You called her mail order. I call her a miracle. She is not what I bought. She is what I waited for." Roy backed toward his wagon, wiping his nose with a silk handkerchief. He climbed aboard and said nothing as he turned the reins. The wagon groaned away, swallowed by the trees. Silence fell. Then from the crowd an old woman stepped forward. Her back was bent, her scarf tattered. She handed Annabelle a piece of hard bread wrapped in linen. Her eyes met Elias's. "Looks like someone finally bought back his soul, too." And with that, she walked away, her boots crunching softly on the frost. Elias didn't let go of Annabelle's hand. Inside, the fire burned steady, and though no vows had yet been spoken, something permanent had taken root. Not in law, not in paper, but in action. And in love. Spring arrived gently in Montana, not with trumpets, but with softened soil, blooming grass, and wind that carried the scent of life returning. On a hill overlooking the wide valley, a small group gathered in silence. No ribbons fluttered, no polished boots or wedding bands glinted in the sun. There was only earth, sky, and the hush of those who had come not out of obligation, but to witness. This was the hill where Elias Granger had buried his father years before. He had come here often to speak into the wind, to remember strength, to ask questions no one else could hear. Today he came not alone. Annabelle stood beside him, barefoot in the damp grass, wearing a simple white dress sewn by the old widow who had once handed her bread. The sleeves were slightly uneven, the hem stitched in mismatched thread. But the way it caught the wind made her look like a painting that had once been folded away. Now finally framed, her hair fell loose over her shoulders. In her hands, she held a single sprig of clover. Elias wore his oldest shirt, clean but faded at the seams. In the breast pocket, a sprig of dried lavender peeked out, his mother's favorite flower. His boots were scuffed, his hands stained from wood and work. But his eyes were steady. The town's old preacher, who had once scoffed at mail-order brides and called them paper promises, now stood with his Bible open and voice softened by time. "I have read many vows in my life," he said. "But today I will say none, because this is not tradition. This is something older." Elias turned to Annabelle. From his pocket he pulled a long braided cord made of dried meadow grass. It was rough, uneven, but strong. He held it out, hands trembling slightly. "Not a vow for show," he said. "A promise in dust, in years, in the storm that brought you to me. I'm yours, Annabelle, in full." Annabelle's lips quivered. Her voice came soft but clear. "And I've always been mine until now, because now I'm yours." 2. He tied the grass cord gently around both their wrists. It held. The wind lifted just then, as if exhaling, and from a fence post nearby, a small brown sparrow landed. Clara, standing beside the widow, clapped her hands. "They got wings now," she shouted. Laughter broke the stillness. Not loud, not mocking, but the kind that comes when a heart unclenches, when healing is no longer a hope, but a fact. After the ceremony, guests quietly began their descent. Some left small tokens, bundles of dried herbs, cloth dolls, a jar of preserves on a wooden bench near the hilltop. Elias turned to Annabelle. "There's something I want to show you." They walked hand in hand to the great oak tree where his father's cross still stood, weathered and worn, but unmoved. Beneath it, Elias knelt and opened a box carved from pine, the hinges rusted but intact. Inside was a single photograph, his mother, young and smiling. Holding a tin cup and a newborn lamb, Elias placed it gently beside another photo. One recently taken, one he'd asked a traveling photographer to capture without Annabelle knowing. Her sitting on the porch with Clara in her lap, both of them laughing. He stood and looked at the two images side by side. "Now they're both here," he said. "Two women who gave me life." Annabelle stepped behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and rested her cheek against his back. "And two souls who found each other," she whispered. "Not through letters, but through loss." Elias turned and kissed her brow. That night there was no feast, no dancing, but there was warmth. The cabin glowed with soft candlelight. Clara played on the floor with a straw doll. Annabelle baked cornbread that filled the home with a scent so rich, even silence felt full. Elias sat in his chair, the same one he had carved alone long ago. Now it creaked with the weight of two hands resting on his shoulders. And though he said nothing, his heart spoke loudly. The ranch no longer echoed with quiet. It sang with the sound of wooden wheels, morning laughter, and the clink of tin cups. Chickens clucked, water boiled, the wind tapped gently at the shutters. But more than any sound, more than any sign, the eyes of a man once broken by grief now held something brighter than pain, deeper than hope, love not just found, but stayed. If this story stirred your heart, the quiet courage of Elias, the resilience of Annabelle, and the way love bloomed not from perfection, but from pain, then there are more stories waiting for you on the frontier at Wild West Love Stories. We tell tales of love that defy distance, dust, and despair, of women who endure, of men who remember, of hearts that find their way home even across silence and snow. So if you believe in second chances, in vows made not with gold, but with grit, in the kind of love that leaves a light on in the dark, subscribe now to Wild West Love Stories, because somewhere out there in the wind, another heart is waiting to be found.